Hey y'all, it's Andrea and I'm going over how I made this pet portrait from start to finish. After using the grid method to transfer my sketch over onto the canvas, I decided to go ahead and paint the background first. Now often I will paint the background last, but in this case I decided to paint it first because I knew the value of the background would affect how dark or how light I would have to go with the fur. In order to get this bright blue color, I mixed some regular blue, a little bit of teal and white. The teal was really just to add a little bit more of a pop of color, as white usually takes away some of that saturation. And I did 2 coats of paint to make sure I had a really nice solid color. And I kept the background pretty simple. And I did this because I knew I wanted a more realistic look for the actual dog, for the fur. And I wanted the background, as limited as it might be in space, to contribute but not distract. And I felt like having a nice solid color was the best way to do that. After I finished with the background, I moved on to the underpainting. Similar to how I make my portraits, because I wanted a realistic look, an underpainting was very important to the process. When I want to create something realistic with acrylic paint, it's really important for me to use layers, and having the really dark areas already set out and established really help ease that process afterwards. So to do this, I used a dark gray, and I started by filling out all of the areas that I knew were going to be the darkest, aka the almost black looking colors in my reference picture. Once I had the darkest parts established, I went in and painted gray where the areas of the fur were going to be darker and not necessarily black. At this stage, I also went in and worked on the nose. If you've seen a dog and you see their nose, they have like a very specific texture to that. And in order to do this, I did a lot of tiny little dots, and I did a couple of layers of this to sort of build up the value and transition between the very dark areas of the nose to the lighter areas. And as you can see, in some places I did very thin coats of that gray paint, and in other areas I do go back and make sure that that dark gray is very solid, because I want those areas to be the darkest. Once I had the gray part done of the underpainting, I went in and did a light wash of brown, just so I had something that was similar to the colors I would be using later to build up on. And this will make it much easier later on, so that way I won't have to cover any sort of patches of gray. So when it came to actually painting the fur, it was all about patience and layers. I started out by doing the darker colors first, so that meant mixing a pretty dark brown, just taking regular brown and some black, and slowly layering that on the darkest areas of the pup's face. And I tried not to go too overboard with the dark brown, which is why I'm slowly layering it just in the positions where either there's like dark spots or it's in the shadow. I also use that same dark brown, but in a much thicker layer to paint the pads of the paw. And while I'm layering the paint for the fur, I keep my strokes very short and very light to resemble the fur that a real dog would have. Once I felt comfortable with the dark spots and the darker brown, I went in and added the white fur. Now for this, I didn't want to go pure white, so I took some of the dark brown I had mixed and mixed in some white to make a little bit dark of a white color, slightly leaning brown, but still white enough that you know it's white fur. And I made sure not to make the mix too white of a color because I did later on use white for the highlights, and I wanted to make sure that the pure white would stand out. And similar again to how I did the darker spots, I'm keeping my strokes very light and very short to resemble real fur. After that, I mixed in varying different shades of browns, some lighter, some darker, to really fill in those empty spots where it was just the brown washed over the gray underpainting. But again, I did not do solid colors. I made sure I was layering it very lightly and building up slowly as I needed. And as you can see here, I started adding in white highlights to the eyes and to the nose. And to make sure that the texture of the nose was really emphasized, I did a similar process to what I did in the underpainting, which was making the white into little dots rather than just lines to really emphasize that texture. When it comes to painting realistically with acrylic paint, there are a few different ways to go about that. One of which I've been doing for most of the video, which is using very thin layers and building it up slowly. You can sort of think about it in a sense like of watercolor and painting with watercolor and how slowly you have to build to really get that realistic look. Another method, of course, is painting wet into wet paint and mixing it that way. However, acrylic is usually very fast drying unless you're using some type of medium to really slow that dry time down. Which is why I personally don't do wet into wet paint that often unless I'm working very small areas at a time. However, because I'm working larger areas in this painting, I do for the most part just use thin layers and build it up that way. When it came to painting this specific area, it was a lot about layering this really dark brown that I had made, and it was almost black, and layering white on top of it. I first started off by layering a very thin coat of the black just to establish where the darker areas would be. Once I had that, I went in and added some more black on the darkest areas. After this, I took a step back and decided to work on the whitest part of the fur and made sure I had a really bright white to contrast against the rest of the fur. Using that same white, I layered it on very lightly on top of the dark brown black paint that I used. This let me create a sort of dark gray gradient from the white to the darkest area of the mouth. At this point, I started adding in highlights around the nose and then also the white whiskers. Then I got to work on the paws, which was very similar in process. I started out with white. I use a mainly pure white for the brightest areas of the paws, And using some of that dark brown and black, I mixed out a sort of grayish shade for all the darker areas. And again, just taking my time and layering all the paints, all the colors to really create that realistic look. Now, unfortunately, my camera did die soon after this, but here is the final result. Overall, I really love it, and most of all, I'm super glad that the person I made this for loved it as well. Thank you guys so much for watching and following along. I'll see you guys next week with a new video.